Lucy sat cross-legged on the worn couch in her small apartment, a glass of wine in one hand, her phone in the other. The night had started as an ordinary one, just her and a few friends gathered for a low-key evening. They were laughing, swapping stories, and watching trashy reality TV, the kind of night they all needed after a long work week. A pile of pizza boxes lay forgotten on the coffee table, and the air was thick with the comforting scent of melted cheese and garlic. "You should do it, Lucy," Kate urged, her eyes glinting mischievously as she leaned forward from her seat on the armchair. She had that daring look in her eye, the one that always meant trouble. "I don't know. Isn't this kind of ridiculous?" Lucy replied, chuckling as she scrolled through the website on her phone. "Psychic hotlines? Do people still fall for this stuff?" "Come on, don't be a spoil sport," said Rachel, perched on the other side of the couch. "It'll be hilarious. Just imagine what they'll say. Probably something about finding your true love or getting rich in the next year. It's all fake anyway." Lucy smirked. Deep down, she wasn't convinced this would be anything more than a goofy prank call. She wasn't superstitious, and she definitely didn't believe in psychics. She was the kind of person who liked facts and logic, things you could measure and explain. A psychic hotline? That was nothing more than entertainment for the gullible, but the idea had piqued her curiosity. She'd never actually spoken to a psychic before, and after all, what was the harm? She glanced at the number on her screen. "Madame Serena's Psychic Hotline. Call to reveal your future." "Well," Lucy said with a dramatic sigh, "if you insist." She clicked the dial button, her phone's screen lighting up as it connected to the hotline. Her friends leaned in closer, eagerly waiting for the antics to begin. The line clicked, and a voice came through the receiver, low, crackling, and unexpectedly serious. "This is Madame Serena," said the woman on the other end, her voice thick with an accent that Lucy couldn't quite place. The tone was grave, almost otherworldly, like it belonged to someone who had lived 100 lives. "I see things others cannot. Tell me, child, why have you called?" Lucy had to stifle a laugh. She exchanged a look with Kate, who grinned and gestured for her to go on. This was exactly the over-the-top, dramatic voice she'd expected, but still something about it unsettled her. She shook off the odd feeling. "Oh, you know," Lucy said, playing along. "Just curious about my future. Maybe you can tell me something fun." There was a long pause, the kind of silence that grows thicker with each second, making Lucy shift uncomfortably on the couch. The laughter and light-hearted energy in the room seemed to drain away, and even her friends went quiet. The air grew colder, or maybe that was just her imagination. She could hear the faint crackle of static on the line, like distant whispers through the phone. Then the woman spoke again, her voice more intense, more focused this time. "You are in grave danger," she said, her words chilling and deliberate. "Beware the fourth caller." Lucy's smile faltered. "What? What are you talking about?" "The fourth caller," the woman repeated, her tone unwavering. "You will receive 3 calls. The first will come soon, and then another, and then a third. Each time they will come closer. But it is the fourth caller you must fear. They will take your life." Lucy's heart skipped a beat. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from playful to oppressive, the laughter from minutes earlier now forgotten. Her friends exchanged nervous glances, unsure if this was part of the act or something more sinister. "What do you mean, Lucy started, but the voice interrupted her, now a low whisper that crawled up her spine. "The fourth caller will come for you," Madame Serena said, "and when they do, there will be no escape." And then, just as abruptly as it had started, the line went dead. Lucy stared at the phone, frozen. The silence in the room was suffocating, her friends as motionless as she was. For a moment, no one spoke. Finally, Kate broke the silence with a forced laugh. "Well, that was creepy as hell." Rachel nodded. her usual bright smile gone, replaced with an expression that looked more like concern than amusement. What was that? Some kind of sick joke? Lucy shook her head, trying to clear the strange unease that had settled over her. "It's nothing," she said, though her voice didn't sound convincing, even to herself. "Just a weird coincidence, right? I mean, it's just a scam." They probably say creepy stuff to everyone. But even as she said it, Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that the call had felt too personal. The woman's voice, the way she had spoken so confidently about the fourth caller, it didn't feel like a generic fortune teller's warning. It felt like a threat. Kate reached over and grabbed Lucy's phone, giving her a teasing smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Okay, enough of that," she said. "Time for a drink. Let's forget about that creepy old psychic." But Lucy couldn't forget. Not really. As the evening went on, her friends' laughter slowly returned, and they tried to move past the bizarre moment. They joked about the call, trying to turn it into something silly again, but Lucy's mind kept drifting back to that voice. 3 calls, then the 4th. She shook off the thought and laughed along with her friends, pretending that the psychic's warning hadn't affected her. But as the night went on and her friends finally left, Lucy found herself staring at her phone, wondering if maybe, just maybe, there was something more to the woman's words. It was just a joke, she told herself. Just a prank. There was nothing to worry about. But as she lay in bed that night, trying to sleep, the words kept repeating in her mind over and over again. Beware the 4th caller. Lucy didn't give much thought to the psychic's warning after that night. The tension had eased once her friends left, and by the next morning, the whole thing seemed like a ridiculous prank. Something meant to get under her skin, but nothing more. The eerie voice of Madame Serena faded into the background as Lucy dove back into her busy routine. Life, after all, didn't leave much room for superstitions. Days passed uneventfully. Work consumed her attention, keeping her days filled with meetings, deadlines, and the comforting predictability of spreadsheets and emails. When Lucy wasn't at the office, she was either grabbing dinner with friends or indulging in her guilty pleasures, true crime podcasts and cheesy horror movies. She lived a life grounded in reality, one where the unexplained had no place. It wasn't until the first call came that she started to feel the creeping unease she'd buried. It was late, nearly midnight, and Lucy had just settled into bed, wrapping herself in blankets against the chill of the autumn night. Her apartment, usually cozy, felt strangely cold that evening, though she dismissed it as a draft coming through the window. She had just drifted into that hazy state between sleep and wakefulness when the sudden shrill ring of her phone shattered the silence. Startled, Lucy sat up, fumbling for her phone on the nightstand. The screen glowed in the darkness, and she squinted at the unfamiliar number displayed on it. She hesitated, thinking about letting it go to voicemail. Who calls this late? Curiosity won out. She pressed the answer button and lifted the phone to her ear. Hello? Silence. For a moment, Lucy thought the call had dropped. She pulled the phone away from her ear, glancing at the screen to see if the call was still connected. It was. Hello, she repeated, more insistent this time. The only response was a strange sound in the background, faint but unmistakable. Heavy, labored breathing, like someone was on the other end, listening but refusing to speak. Lucy's heart gave a sharp, nervous thud in her chest. She waited, the silence pressing against her, growing heavier with each passing second. And then she heard it, a faint ticking sound, rhythmic and persistent, like the ticking of a clock. The noise was barely audible, but it was there, steady and relentless. Tick, tick, tick. A shiver ran down her spine. Who is this? Lucy demanded, her voice harder now, trying to mask the growing unease she felt. No answer, just more of that breathing and the ticking, ticking, ticking. She hung up, her heart racing, and tossed the phone onto the bed as if it had burned her. Lucy took a deep breath, shaking her head. It was probably just a prank call, some bored kid or random creep trying to mess with her. But that ticking sound, it had felt wrong. It felt too familiar. She told herself it was nothing, just a coincidence. She'd almost forgotten about Madame Serena's words. Almost. The second call came 2 days later. Lucy was back in her apartment after a long day at work. She had kicked off her shoes, changed into an oversized sweater, and settled onto the couch with a glass of wine, trying to relax. The television buzzed in the background, but she wasn't paying much attention to it. She was scrolling through her phone, distracted, when it rang again. The number was different this time, but still unfamiliar. Lucy stared at the screen for a long moment, a knot tightening in her stomach. Her finger hovered over the decline button, but something made her hesitate. She didn't want to answer, not after the last call, but the curiosity gnawed at her. She pressed accept. "Hello," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Again, there was no response. Nothing but the same heavy breathing on the other end, slow and deliberate, as if whoever it was wanted her to know they were listening. And behind it, faint but unmistakable, the ticking. Tick, tick, tick. It was exactly the same as before. "Who is this?" she asked, anger rising to combat the fear that had lodged itself in her chest. "Stop calling me." There was no response. The breathing grew louder for a moment, then softened again, blending into the ticking. Lucy's hands were shaking as she hung up. She dropped her phone onto the coffee table, staring at it like it might come to life. Her mind raced, replaying the psychic's words from that strange night over and over again. "Beware the fourth caller. You will receive 3 calls before the 4th comes to take your life." She had laughed it off at the time, but now the calls were happening, exactly as Madame Serena had predicted. "No," Lucy muttered under her breath, forcing herself to stand up, to move, to do anything that might break the tension building in her apartment. "This isn't real. It's just a coincidence." She walked to the kitchen, pacing as she tried to shake the growing fear. This couldn't be happening. Psychics weren't real, and predictions like that didn't come true. This had to be some sick joke, right? But deep down, she knew it wasn't a joke. Something was happening. And it wasn't over yet. The 3rd call came a week later. By now, Lucy was dreading the sound of her phone ringing. She kept it on silent most of the time, only checking it when she had to. But that night, she couldn't escape it. The call came in the middle of the night, rousing her from sleep like the others. This time, the number was blocked. No information, just the call. Lucy's heart pounded as she stared at the screen. Her hands were clammy, her mouth dry. She wanted to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't happening, but she knew she couldn't. The psychic's warning echoed in her head. The 3rd call, then the 4th. With a shaking hand, she answered. "Whoever this is, stop calling me," she said immediately, her voice tight with fear and anger. The breathing was there again, heavier this time, closer. It was as though the caller was standing right beside her, their breath hot and ragged. And like before, that damn ticking. Tick, tick, tick. Lucy's chest tightened. She gripped the phone so hard her knuckles turned white. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper now. The breathing stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but the ticking clock. And then, just before she hung up, she heard something else, something that sent a jolt of terror down her spine. A whisper, so faint she could barely make it out, but it was there. Soon, Lucy dropped the phone, her whole body trembling. The 4th call was coming. Lucy's world had shifted. It was as though the very air around her had thickened, becoming something oppressive and heavy, something she could no longer shake off. Each day felt darker, her surroundings colder. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward her, and every sound now carried an echo of menace. Her life, once grounded in the ordinary, had become an unsettling blur of sleepless nights and creeping fear. After the third call, she could no longer dismiss the reality of what was happening. Madame Serena's words had transformed from a silly joke into something terrifyingly tangible. She had received 3 calls, just as predicted, and the 4th was coming. The ticking sound haunted her now. It wasn't confined to the eerie silence of those anonymous calls anymore. She heard it everywhere, in her apartment, at work, even in the white noise of the bustling city streets. Sometimes it seemed faint, like a distant clock hidden somewhere in the walls, ticking quietly just out of reach. Other times it was louder, more insistent, as if the ticking was getting closer, counting down to something, counting down to her. At night, her dreams were no refuge. They had become vivid, disturbing, and drenched in a strange darkness she couldn't escape. In every dream, there was the ticking clock, louder and more menacing than before. The ticking grew faster, more urgent, as if it were racing toward some final moment, her moment. One night, Lucy dreamed she was in a vast, dimly lit room. The walls were bare, featureless, and stretched endlessly into darkness. She stood at the center of the room, surrounded by a silence so profound it felt suffocating. In front of her, a large ancient clock stood tall, its pendulum swinging back and forth with an almost hypnotic rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. The sound reverberated in her skull, steady, unavoidable. She tried to move, to step away from the clock, but her feet were glued to the floor, paralyzed by some unseen force. The ticking grew louder, filling the empty space around her, until it seemed to be coming from inside her own chest. Tick, tick, tick. She watched in horror as the clock's hands inched closer to midnight, the final moment drawing near. In her dream, Lucy wanted to scream, to run, but she could do nothing but stare at the clock as it prepared to strike. And then, as the minute hand reached 12, a voice whispered in the darkness, "There's no escape." The words sent a jolt of terror through her, but the voice wasn't a stranger's. It was her own voice, distant and hollow, echoing through the room like a death knell. The ticking stopped, the silence pressing down on her like a weight she could no longer bear. She woke with a gasp, her heart pounding in her chest, her sheets damp with sweat. The ticking still echoed in her ears, fading slowly but never quite disappearing. Lucy lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, trying to slow her breathing, but the dream clung to her, refusing to let go. There's no escape. The days began to blur together after that. Lucy's grip on reality was slipping, unraveling at the edges. The constant ticking sound seemed to follow her everywhere, like a ghost she couldn't shake. At work, she would find herself drifting off, staring blankly at her computer screen as the ticking echoed faintly in the back of her mind. Her co-workers noticed the change, of course. They noticed how quiet she had become, how she jumped at the slightest noise, how the bags under her eyes had darkened with exhaustion. "Are you okay, Lucy?" her manager, Greg, asked one afternoon, frowning with concern as she zoned out during a team meeting. "You've seemed a little distracted lately. Maybe you need some time off." Lucy forced a smile, though it felt strained. "I'm fine," she lied. "Just tired. Haven't been sleeping well." Greg nodded, but he didn't seem convinced. She could tell from the way he lingered after the meeting, watching her as though she might break at any moment. And maybe she would. The truth was, Lucy felt like she was losing her mind. The psychic's prediction was coming true in ways she couldn't explain. The calls, the ticking, the dreams. It was all too much to dismiss. She tried to convince herself that it was just stress, that her mind was playing tricks on her, but deep down, she knew the 4th call was inevitable. The 4th caller was coming for her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Desperation drove Lucy to search for Madame Serena, hoping against hope that she could somehow explain the terror Lucy had been living through. She spent hours combing through the internet, trying to find any information on the Psychic Hotline, but it led nowhere. It was as if Madame Serena had never existed at all. Frustrated, Lucy began to call local psychic shops, asking about Madame Serena, but no one seemed to know who she was. After weeks of dead ends, she finally tracked down a small, shabby psychic shop on the outskirts of town. An elderly woman with wiry gray hair and a suspicious gaze answered the door when Lucy knocked. "I'm looking for Madame Serena," Lucy said, her voice tight with desperation. The woman's expression darkened at the mention of the name. "You won't find her here," she said, her voice curt. "Serena's been dead for years." Lucy's blood ran cold. "What? That can't be right. I spoke to her. I spoke to her just a few weeks ago." The woman shook her head, her eyes narrowing. "That's impossible. Serena passed away a long time ago. You must have spoken to someone else." But Lucy knew it hadn't been anyone else. The voice on the phone, the way she had spoken, it had been her. It had been Madame Serena. "Is there anything you can do?" Lucy asked, her voice trembling. "Please, I need to know how to stop this." The woman eyed Lucy for a long moment before finally sighing. "Some things can't be stopped, child. Some fates are sealed from the moment they're spoken." Lucy felt the weight of those words settle over her, cold and final. She thanked the woman and left the shop, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been hoping for answers, for some way out, but instead she had been given more questions and the gnawing certainty that whatever was coming for her, she couldn't escape it. The ticking grew louder as the days passed. It followed Lucy everywhere, now constant and relentless, an ominous reminder that her time was running out. She could feel the clock counting down, inching closer and closer to the final call. Every time she picked up her phone, her hand trembled, wondering if this would be the moment the fourth call came. Each night her dreams grew darker, more twisted. The ticking clock now dominated every dream, the sound deafening, drowning out everything else. The figure in the shadows, always there, always watching, was closer now, its presence suffocating. She could feel it waiting, just out of reach, waiting for the final moment to strike. One night in a dream, Lucy stood in front of a mirror. The reflection staring back at her wasn't quite her. It looked like her, but there was something wrong, something twisted about the way her reflection smiled. The ticking was loud in her ears, so loud it hurt. She reached out to touch the mirror, but before her fingers made contact, her reflection spoke. "There's no escape." Lucy jolted awake, her heart racing, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The clock was still ticking. The night had never felt so long. Lucy sat in the center of her darkened apartment, every light turned off, every blind drawn shut. The glow from the streetlights outside barely seeped through the cracks in her curtains, casting pale, ghostly lines across the floor. The air was thick, still, pressing down on her like the weight of an invisible hand. She hadn't moved from the spot in hours, sitting cross-legged on the floor, her phone resting in front of her like a ticking time bomb. Midnight was coming. The moment Madame Serena had foretold was nearly here, and Lucy could feel it, something, in the room with her, waiting in the shadows. The ticking had grown louder over the last few hours. At first, it had been faint, a subtle background noise that blended with the hum of the city beyond her windows. But now it filled the room, insistent, echoing off the walls. It wasn't just in her head anymore. It was real as the fear that clawed at her throat. Tick, tick, tick. Her heart beat in rhythm with the sound, each thud of her pulse matching the relentless ticking that surrounded her. Lucy's eyes were glued to the clock on the wall, watching as the minute hand crept closer to 12. Her fingers trembled in her lap, and she fought the urge to reach for the phone, to turn it off, to do anything that might stop the call from coming. But she knew it wouldn't matter. The fourth call would come. It had always been coming, and there was no stopping it. Madame Serena had warned her. 3 calls had passed. The fourth would be her last. As the seconds ticked by, Lucy thought back to the first time she had laughed about the psychic's warning. It had seemed like a joke, a harmless prank. She had never believed in fate, in curses, or premonitions. But now, as the final moment closed in on her, she wondered how she had been so foolish. What had been the point of her denial? The calls had come, exactly as predicted. The voice in her dreams had whispered the truth. There was no escape. She had spent weeks trying to outsmart something that had always been inevitable. The clock on the wall struck midnight. Her phone rang. Lucy's breath caught in her throat. The sound of the ringing phone cut through the silence, sharp and final, like the tolling of a funeral bell. She stared at the glowing screen, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no number this time, just a blank screen that displayed "Unknown caller." Her hands trembled as she reached for the phone. Her fingertips brushed the cold surface of the screen, but she hesitated, a wild, desperate hope flickering in her chest. Maybe if she didn't answer, if she just let it ring, the fourth call wouldn't happen. Maybe she could stop it after all. But she knew the truth. The call wasn't coming from the outside, it was coming for her, from inside her. The phone stopped ringing. For a moment, there was silence. Lucy let out a shaky breath, her heart thudding so loudly she could feel it in her throat. She stared at the screen, praying that it was over. Then the phone rang again. The sound was deafening, like it filled the entire room, vibrating through the floor and walls, pounding in her skull. This time, she couldn't ignore it. The fourth caller had come. With trembling hands, she answered. "Hello?" she whispered, barely able to force the word from her lips. There was no response, only the sound of that familiar, heavy breathing, slow, deliberate, as if someone was right there in the room with her, just behind her, unseen. And then, behind the breathing, the ticking, that relentless, maddening ticking. Tick, tick, tick. Lucy's grip tightened on the phone. Her voice cracked when she spoke again, panic rising in her chest like a flood. "What do you want from me?" For a moment, the only answer was the ticking. Then slowly, a voice emerged from the other side of the line, soft at first, but unmistakable. It was her own voice. There's no escape. Lucy's blood ran cold. The voice on the other end of the line, so eerily calm, so detached. It was her. Not someone who sounded like her, but her. Speaking from some place she couldn't understand, as though part of her was lost in the darkness. "Who are you?" she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. The voice on the line let out a slow, steady breath. Then, with an eerie calm, it replied, "I've been waiting, Lucy. We've always been waiting." Lucy clutched the phone tighter, her knuckles white, tears stinging the corners of her eyes. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The ticking was growing louder now, faster, like a countdown to something inevitable. The voice continued, her voice, the fourth caller, soft and chilling. "It's time, Lucy. You've always known it was time." Lucy's chest heaved as she tried to speak, her voice breaking. "Please, no, I don't." The ticking stopped. A cold silence swallowed the room, more suffocating than any sound. Lucy's body went rigid, and she could feel it. The presence she had sensed for weeks, the figure from her dreams. It was here, standing over her, unseen but undeniable. She looked down at her phone, her vision blurring with tears. The screen had gone dark, but the voice was still there, filling her mind. "Your time is up." In that final moment, everything became clear. The ticking hadn't been counting down to a call, it had been counting down to her. And just as she understood that truth, her phone slipped from her hands. It clattered onto the floor, the sound lost in the suffocating quiet. Lucy's breath stilled. The darkness around her seemed to close in, wrapping her in its cold embrace. There was no escape, and the clock struck 12. The next morning, Lucy's apartment was silent. The phone lay on the floor where it had fallen, the screen cracked, its battery dead. The clock on the wall no longer ticked. Its hands were frozen, locked in place at the exact moment it had struck midnight. Lucy was gone. There was no trace of her, no sign of struggle, no clue as to where she had disappeared. Only the silence remained, heavy and oppressive, like a lingering shadow. Outside, the world continued as it always had, unaware, uncaring that another life had been claimed by the ticking clock. And somewhere, far off in the distance, a phone began to ring.